I wrote several months ago, in fact, I think over a year ago, on the Substack, how Vatican II was a color revolution, a coup, in other words, a modernist coup inside the church. That's what color revolutions are. They're political events meant to peacefully usher in a revolution. And I want to just go through some of this. I'll explain more in my upcoming book on the council. But first things first, what happened at the council? How was it a coup? How was it a revolution? Well, one, the theologians who were censored by the church, officially, the Holy Office in Rome, before the council, those like Yves Congar, Father Schillebeeckx, others, John Courtney Murray, he was an American clergyman, Jesuit. They played an enormous, outsized role on the actual documents of Vatican II. In fact, it was Cardinal Avery Dulles later in life who said, Yves Congar, you might as well call it Congar's Council. First point, the men censored before Vatican II played an enormous role at the council. Second, they wrote later on and admitted the documents were purposefully ambiguous so they could garner support from the conservatives and later weaponize and use them for their own purpose. And here is my blog on that. And I'll read just a couple quotes here from some of the more problematic clergy at the council. Cardinal Leo Suenens, he was probably one of the worst cardinals who attended the council. He said, in the conciliar text, there are some formulas whose aim was to counterbalance other assertions or win wider assent, in some cases like temporary stopping places in a long climb. Father Edward Schillebeeckx, a few schema intended to adopt formulas with double meaning. Here's Father de Lubac. The title of the first part of Gaudium et Spes, even more so in French than in Latin, has an ambiguous tone, and undoubtedly this ambiguity was necessary. Just two more. Father René Laurentin. Here and there, ambiguity was cultivated in Gaudium et Spes as an example from inextricable oppositions. Formulas were widely calculated to leave the road open to opposing options, hence a certain fluctuation in the texts. And lastly, Cardinal Augustin Bea, it is necessary to perfect the text afterwards. Okay, so second point, ambiguous doctrines. We know this is not what the Holy Spirit speaks like. We know the Holy Spirit says, let your yes be yes, your no be no, and speak the truth in season and out. So the dissidents got in there and they rewrote the documents ambiguously so they could be used later on. Second point. Third point, the liberal bloc of clergy met before the council and schemed to throw out the original documents. Most people don't know, in fact, most Catholics don't know, there was original documents prepared by the Vatican over several years that were to be considered when the council opened. The liberals got together, planned how to subvert them with help from John the 23rd, and broke the council's rules repeatedly to get what they wanted. Did this right off the bat when Cardinal Leinart and Frings, who was a German cardinal, the head of the German bishops, and he had as his assistant Father, you might know the name, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Okay, Frings stood up at the very first meeting and said, we demand a vote on those who will be on various commissions at the council. Now, this was illegal. It was not according to the rules. In fact, the cardinal who was in charge of the opening session, Frings said, I need the microphone. I'm going to demand something. And the cardinal said, no, I can't allow you. That's against the rules. It's not on the agenda. But Frings got up and did it anyway. He disobeyed. And who else disobeys? We know the devil does. He said, no, I will not obey. And Cardinal Frings said, I will not obey the rules of the council. And there were other various violations from the various liberals who were a part of the progressive faction, the minority, eccentric faction at the council, who could not have done anything that they did without a council. Okay, this is why John called it, because he knew at a council there would be chaos, and you can strategically plan maneuvers at a council that you couldn't in just normal times. In one instance, the conservatives at the council wanted a document to condemn communism, and they handed it off to one of the priests in charge of one of the sessions, and he just tabled it, and he just ignored it. So third point, the liberals broke the rules multiple occasions at the council. Fourth, global media outlets like Time Magazine and others propped up liberal clergy and used misleading and vague terms like renewal and reform to advance the modernist agenda. This gave dissidents and others a sense of inevitability while also masking their true aim, which was to abolish long-standing church teachings in order to appease Protestants. That was the goal. That was the entire goal. This is why you had at the council a number of non-Catholic observers, which we'll talk about in just a second, but why the media targeted more than anybody else Cardinal Ottaviani. He was an Italian cardinal in charge of the Holy Office, which is the highest ranking office in the Vatican because it controlled and taught on the church's doctrinal teachings. And he was plastered on the front of many newspapers and just derided left, right, and center. It's a classic Marxist Alinskyite tactic to polarize the enemy and to make them discredited. And they did that to Cardinal Ottaviani because he was the biggest face of the opposition. So the media was in bed with the dissidents at this event. And this is why you saw John the 23rd, as well as Father John Courtney Murray, on the cover of Time magazine during those years. And it's because the media, in fact, Time magazine specifically, its owner, Henry Luce, and his wife, Claire, they were very interested in using, and were very friends with, actually, John Courtney Murray, the co-author of Dignitatis Humanae. So they had to amplify him, right, and promote that. And so a lot of their writers in their articles said, oh, there's a lot of renewal and reform going on. Michael Novak, who is he's now deceased, a reporter for Time magazine, very liberal. He called the oath against modernism that St. Pius X instituted an outdated thing. He said this in the 1960s, and he wrote a book called Open Church. That was the term back then. An open church, open to renewal and reform. All right, point number 5. Non-Catholic observers, as I said, attended the council and had a direct impact not only on the council, but on the documents and what they actually said. They were used more or less as a weapon by the liberal faction to intimidate the conservatives so they would need to garner courage to speak their minds honestly. This was, in a very real sense, interference on the proceedings. If you read books like Anglican Bishop John Mormon, he wrote a book on the council. Paul Blanchard, who was an American secularist at the time, he wrote a book on the council. They all admit they were given the highest courtesies of engaging with cardinals, meeting with them, especially Cardinal Bea's Committee on Christian Unity and Father Wildebrands. Several of them had audiences with John the 23rd. Michael Davies, the historian, notes this in his writings. And they interfered, basically, right? Their actions and their pressure campaign really did have an influence on the documents. You can read this in all of the quotes that those who are honest historians about the council actually say about it. And beyond that, again, the conservatives were mocked by the observers, their liberal opponents, and the media for being entrenched and rigid. Those are some of the biggest and most often used phrases that were used at them. Again, this is part of a psychological campaign to grind them down and to make them feel, yes, we are on the losing side of things. This is an era of openness and optimism, instead of just condemning the modern world, which all councils previous to Vatican II did. And so, when all the documents that were prepared beforehand were thrown out, again, go look up the original schemas of Vatican II. You will hear from apologists for the council that those were rigid and terse and insular and out of step with the times. In fact, if you go read them, completely orthodox, very Thomistic, very scholastic, crystal clear, no ambiguous language. Those were thrown out very early on in the council. So every document had to be rewritten. If you're part of the preparatory commissions, like Archbishop Lefebvre was, like Cardinal Ottaviani was, and others, and within the first year of the council, they're all tossed out, it's going to be demoralizing. And it made it all that more harder, I think, to fight for a lot of them. So eventually what happened? The conservatives, yes, did vote for the documents, but it was because some parts of them, when read with the traditional lens, did suggest continuity with the actual traditional teachings of the church. They also actually didn't even read many of these documents. So the document on modern modes of communication, which is one of the very first ones to have passed at the council, Father Xavier Rinn, who was a journalist for the New Yorker at the time, who wrote under a pen name, he said that many of the cardinals and bishops at the council voted for that schema without even reading it. They just trusted many of the council fathers that others who were voting on these schemas, they just followed what their bishops' conference told them. So if you're an American clergyman, bishop, or cardinal, and the higher ups in the bishops' conference are saying, "Hey, yes, you got to vote for this." It's sort of like Congress, right? There's factions and there's interest groups, like the Tea Party. Remember the Tea Party? Well, you kind of hang together, and that's exactly what happened. A lot of these continents and their bishops' conferences just went along with what their leaders told them, right? Because if you're in Germany, you don't want to get on the bad side of Cardinal Frings, right? Or any of the other high-ranking cardinals in your nation. So you go along with them. That's how a lot of the voting happened. And the conservatives, obviously, again, wanted to show the world that the church was unified. Who wants to go to the council and then say, okay, yeah, a lot of problems with these documents, and then say, well, yeah, but I'm going to be the one or two that stands up against all of it? You're going to start to second guess yourself and say, hey, like, I don't want to be on the Pope's bad side. And, some parts of this document sounds reasonable. There might be some problematic things, but of course, we're not going to interpret them in the worst way, right? So you don't want to get on anyone's bad side. And eventually, a lot of the conservatives were just demoralized with the process. Again, the constant browbeating in the media, liberals openly mocking and jeering you when you're trying to make a point in front of all the other cardinals and bishops on the council floor, and then fighting just to get like one or two sentences that it sounds orthodox and sounds traditional into a massive document. Again, Vatican II had over 100,000 words in Latin. You had to go through multiple, layers just to get phrases inserted. And then, like, you fight for it, and most of the document is just trash. And then you get your part in there, so you're going to go along with it. And that's how many of them went along with it. And they just hoped for the best.